Hello and welcome to our next session on estimating customer exposure. This is the third session in our series on selling treasury products, and we've covered a fair bit of ground in our first two sessions where we laid the foundation for some of the tools that we're going to use in this specific session. For the purpose of this session, what we've done is we've used an actual case study from some real life work that we did for a client. The case study deals with the risk management and hedging needs of a crude oil refinery operating in an emerging market. One of the first questions that comes up is there's an actual lag between the time that crude oil is purchased, it arrives, and is converted into a product that is then sold in market for distribution. The challenge is that in the 30 days that it takes for the refinery to place an order for purchasing crude to the time that that crude actually physically arrives and is converted into a product, the retail prices are set by a market price regulator. And these retail prices are actually linked and are dependent to what's happening in international markets. So one of their big risk and exposures that they worry about is that, if prices move in the international market and those prices are used by the regulator to set prices at a level that is below our cost, what would happen? The market regulator links prices to international crude prices, right? And this is linked to a specific blend. So there is also a question of how closely the input that they produce, the input that they consume to produce the output that they produce, how closely is this input blend related to the international blend used by the regulator to set prices. There is a 30-day price lag in every price reset, both on the input side and on the output side. Right? So that's the context for our case. Now let's see how we move forward. So if I graphically represent the question that the client asked us, the first question was, there is a price fix, and this price fix happens on two sides. The supplier of crude updates prices at the end of the month. The regulator also updates prices at the end of the month. The supplier of crude sets prices on a backward-looking basis. So on the 30th or the 31st of the month, he would simply come out and announce that on all purchases picked up over the last 30 days, here's the price. The regulator, on the other hand, sets prices on a forward-looking basis. So he goes out and says that all sales of petrochemical products in the local market would now be sold at this new price. So one question is, what's the manufacturing lag? And if you think in terms of the time that an order is placed for purchase of crude to the time it's actually shipped, you've got about a 4-week lag. And then anywhere between 10 to 15 days from the point that the crude actually reaches the refinery to the point that it's produced and actually reaches retail distribution outlets such as petrol and gas pumps. So they have two questions. Their first question is, what is the shape and form? So what is the shape and form of our exposure? Are we exposed to prices going up? Are we exposed to prices falling down? And in the setting, in the context that we are interested in, how does prices going up and prices coming down have an impact on our accounting P&L and possibly even on our balance sheet, right? That's the question. So, but to begin with, our focus and our discussion would primarily center around the P&L impact. Now, when you work within a refinery, you actually have a list of products that a refinery produces. So the assumption that we've made is that this refinery, for every barrel of crude that it consumes, produces a portfolio of petrochemical products. And what is included in these petrochemical products? So we've got high sulfur fuel oil, which is about 32%. We've got naphtha, which is about 0%. We've got motor gas, which is petroleum products. We've got high octane fuel or high octane motor gas, which is HOBC. Then we've got kerosene, which goes for aircrafts. We've got kerosene, and then a variation of kerosene, which is called aviation fuel or jet fuel, which goes for aircraft. High speed diesel and LDO, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This output mix determines what are called gross revenue margins for the refinery in question, right? That's the first step. So if I have this mix, I have a fair idea of what the refinery will produce and where prices would be for this specific product in both my market and international market. The second thing that I want in terms of assumption is the change in the price of crude oil in a unit that I can work with. So in this specific case, I'm saying, prices of crude oil for the period in question that I'm working with and studying with, moved by about minus 27% on the downside and about 14 plus and more on the upside. So that gives me a range. But the bulk of changes were around zero, and this is price changes on a month by month basis. So 1 month, the next month, what was the price change? And the most common changes other than zero was an increase of about 5% and a decrease of about 4%. My worst case decrease of 27%, my best case increase is about 14%. So this sort of sets the context for price of input. This is the range by which price of input can actually go out and vary. Now look at output price changes. What I've done is, if you remember the product matrix that I'd used that gave me my gross revenue margins or gross refined product margins, if I look at my GRMs, my output price changes tracks that based on the input price changes and the translation of those input price changes into output prices. How much have my output prices changed over the period from 2005 to 2010? In this case, I'm saying, my worst case change is about 44-45%. My best case change is about 9%. So effectively what you're saying 27% and 14+% translates into a loss of about 44% on the margin side to a gain of about 9.1%. Doesn't translate directly into 27% and 14%, translates into 44% and 99.1%. And then if I look at the change in my margins, I also do another layer of analysis where I actually calculate and estimate the real margin change. And in this specific case, I'm saying, in terms of drop in my margin, my low end is about 14%, my high end is about 35% plus. And I'm looking at the period in question from 2005 to 2010. And again, the context is the specific case is a refinery. So the assumption that we've looked at quickly, very, very quickly, we started off with our context, which is price gets fixed by the supplier of crude, price gets fixed by the regulator of petrochemical refined products. There is a manufacturing and processing time lag. There is potential exposure. Our focus is on P&L. Then we moved on and said to move forward, we need to look at what is the product matrix that's used by the refinery to produce refined products. And here's the product matrix. So the analysis that we're doing is based on the numbers that you see here. From here, we move on to the next stage where we say, okay, how volatile are input prices over a period from 2005 to 2010? What's the range of changes that I've seen in prices on a month by month basis? And that's the range, minus 27 to 14%. What's the impact of these changes on my output prices? The impact goes from minus 44% to about 9.1% plus. And then what's the impact on my margins? The impact on my margins is about minus 14% to about 35%. That's the context. Now, we take this context and we do some basic analysis. What we want to do, we want to exactly understand the amount of time that it takes to manufacture the product. And this gives us, along with the shipping delay, the holding period. That's the period in which we're interested in seeing the impact, calculating the impact, calculating the range of price changes that are likely to occur. We also want to look at the the lag between the input price fix and the retail product delivery. We want to look at the breakdown between fixed and variable pricing, breakdown between dollar sensitivity to unit changes in input prices, and estimate the projected impact on P&L. So we take this analysis, take the next stage. The first question I want to ask is, look at my margins and tell me what you see based on a historical analysis of my production, of changes in crude oil prices, changes in output prices, and changes in my net margin. So when I do this analysis, I go out and prepare a table. And in this table, I say, I actually have two models. I have a model where I assume that I actually have an average and low vol world. And then I have a model where I go out and say that I have a high vol world. If you've taken the first two sessions, you know by now that volatility, as we calculate, does not remain constant. It goes up and comes down. And this is on a trailing volatility basis. If you actually price it as you reduce the trailing window, you may see vol go up and down, just like prices. Right? So we're saying the low vol world refers to the low point, the high vol world refers to the high point in that series. This is my low vol world, this is my high vol world. So in my low vol world, the worst possible shock that I can see is plus minus 41.45. In my high vol world, the worst possible shock that I can see is plus minus 363. And this worst case shock is linked to what we call 99 percentile, which effectively means that there is, if I take a look at 100 days, there is going to be one day in those 100 days where I'll see a price shock movement of plus minus 145 or plus minus 363. In this specific case, since we're dealing with a refinery and the history that we have available to us deals with price changes on a monthly basis, in this specific case, we're saying there is a 1% chance, only a 1% chance, if a number of assumptions that we've made in a model hold true, that price movement is going to range from 1 month to the next of a number higher than 145 in a low vol world and higher than 364 in a high vol world. Now, one of the things I wanted to clarify is that in this case, the prices of oil that we're calculating metric tons. So this is not a barrel of oil, this is metric ton of crude input, which basically means that the numbers that you're seeing are not in the 75 to 125 or 60 to 147 range we see for a barrel of oil. Each metric ton has X number of barrels of oil, so this metric ton has been multiplied by that X, and hence the price shock that you see here, which is about 145 to about 363, the prices and the change in prices on a metric ton basis. Now, if you walk down this path and come all the way down here, I'm saying there is a 51 percentile chance. So I'm actually saying if I look at 2 days, one in every 2 days, I'm going to see a movement in prices of about 1.6 and 3.9. 1.6 in a low vol world, 3.9 in a high vol world. And how does this translate into margin shortfall? So what is the margin shortfall question? The margin shortfall question is, what's the chance, what's the probability, what's the likelihood that my margin will fall below the minimum threshold? If I've defined the minimum threshold, I'm actually saying that there is certainly even odds of seeing a 1% break if prices go up. If prices go up and down by the amount that's suggested here. But there is only a 1% chance that you'll actually see a margin shortfall of about 25%. And if you change this to the high world, there is about a 63.4% chance that you'll see a margin shortfall of about 63.4%. That's how much your margins will shrink. When this number turns negative, you're saying margins are actually not going to shrink, margins are actually going to grow. So take the percentile ranking that you see here and then link them with both your low vol and your high vol world to find out what is the likelihood, what is the probability, what is the chance that your margins will grow or shrink by a certain percentage. And then once you've got this table, then there's a simple question that needs to be placed to the board of the client, and that question is, where exactly on this table are you comfortable? So I'm comfortable with margin movements up to 10%. Beyond that, I have an issue. And if I say, my number is about 10% in the low vol world, then I'm saying, from a threshold point of view, I want to cover about 85% of the probability estimate. I'm more and primarily interested in about 15% or about 1:4 odds or 1:5 odds, depending on how you look at it. All right. So this analysis focuses on P&L and margin impact. There is another aspect of this which deals with inventory losses. So the idea is, I bought fuel at a price threshold of 147. By the time it was produced and was ready to be sold in the market, prices had dropped down to 110 or 110 or 108 or 105 or even 90 for that matter. Now the problem is my cost of production for this produce is 147. My cost of input for this produce is 147 plus whatever my processing costs and other expenses are. I can only sell this product in the market at 90. So it's not just a question of the product that I have and the product. It's not just a question of at what level my product gets sold. It's also a question of I actually have a fairly substantial amount of inventory in my storage tanks. That inventory also gets marked down. So now the second part of an analysis basically says that in addition to margin, you actually have another component of P&L, which is your inventory markup and your inventory markdown. And once again, we have the same percentile. We're saying at 99 percentile, you're looking at a loss of about $12 million. At in the low vol world. In the high vol world, that number is going to be about $30 million. So that's your worst case. That's your 99 percentile. That's your 1 in 100 days number. Your most likely, which is 1 in odd day number, is about a loss of about $132,000 on the low vol world and about $332,000 on the high vol world. Once again, as before, if once you get to this table, what you need to do is sit down with the client and ask him how comfortable he or she is with these range of numbers and where does his risk threshold end and finish. So if he says, in the low vol world, I can afford to do about $3.5 million, but I want protection above this, then that's the threshold at which we come in and place a structure that works for the client. Right. Now, so if you think in terms of the questions that we want to ask and the questions that we've been asking using the tool that we've just shared earlier, the first question is, what is the probability that margins will decrease in any month, over the next quarter, the next half year, or the next full year, right? The next question is, what is the range of these projected reductions? So, plus minus what number? And, that's where you go from 99 percentile to 66 percentile. What's the worst case reduction any month over the next 12 months? What's the likely reduction in any month over the next 12 months? If you go back, so from a margin point of view, you're saying, the worst case reduction is about 25% in the low vol world and 63% in the high vol world. And the most likely reduction is about 1% and 3.1% in a low vol world. So 1% in the low vol world and 3.1% in the high vol world. And that's on the margin side. If you look at the P&L impact because of inventory markdowns and markups, in that specific case, your worst case loss is about $12 million in a low vol world, $30 million in a high vol world. And on the low side, you're looking at a most likely change of about $132,000 and $332,000, depending on which world, low vol or high vol world, are you operating in. Other questions? So what's the probability that gross margins will shrink below the minimum profitability threshold? Before you answer this question, you have to ask, what is your minimum threshold? All right. And then what's the probability that gross margins actually turn negative? You may actually start losing money on each barrel of crude that you process and each barrel of produce that you sell. Okay. Once again, you go back and you walk through these percentiles. Now, you can do probabilities or you can do odds. At extreme levels, probabilities lose meaning. So, if you tell the board there is only a 1% chance, the board will immediately discount it. But if you tell the board in the next 3 days or in every pair of 3 days over the next 12 months, 1 in 3 days, we will see a movement or a loss, or we'll have to recognize a movement or a loss of this amount. I think that is a lot more credible number, which then basically means that you don't do your analysis or presentation at 99 percentile. You most likely end up doing at the 75, 66, or 60 percentile level. I think these numbers are a lot more meaningful with respect to discussion with the board. The primary objective of these discussions and asking these questions is to get the board to come down to a point where they can accept and acknowledge their risk appetite. How much money, how much am I comfortable losing? And that defines the protection that is required and desired. Right? That's this how much question, but you can't answer this how much question unless and until you actually have this table. So moving forward, 2 sets of questions. Next set, what's the likely expected margin number at current price levels? How would this number change if volatility moves by a percentage point? How much does a dollar change in crude prices change the expected margin number? Okay. So if you go back to the original table where we looked at crude oil input prices, this was just a first step. If I build a sequence for my model, I'm saying my first step is this. My next step is the impact on output prices. So this is a relationship that I need to figure out in model. Then from this is my, what's the impact on my gross refining margins or my gross margins. And again, there is a relationship between, and this is relation number one. This is number two. Then from my GRM, I move on to what's the impact on my inventory. What's the final impact on my P&L? And all of this is linked to crude oil input price changes. Again, as I said, we've looked at models where volatility went up and then came down and then went up. Right. So in such a scenario, if I have a low vol world, what's the impact of this model? If I have a high vol world, what is the impact of that high vol on this model? And then what's the impact of P&L? Once I have this analysis, then I simply go out and sit with the board till I figure out their risk, preference, and tolerance. The risk, preference, and tolerance tells me the protection level that's required, which tells me the pricing that I need to present in front of them. Now, once I find the pricing and I take the pricing back to the customer, there's a very good chance the customer may come back and come out and say, this doesn't work. This doesn't work for one simple reason, because it's too costly. And once he says it's too costly, that's when you sit down and figure out what's the best possible structure for this deal. This is where the product portfolio that we looked at in our first session comes into play. This is where you sit down and try and understand how the business model of the customer operates, not in one day, not over 1 month, but over the next 3 to 5 years. What are the drivers that push, where's profitability? What are the drivers? There you go, that's profitability. What are the drivers that control profitability over a long period of time? And based on this driver, what is the most appropriate structure for this customer? All right. So very, very short, very, very brief case study. Quick wrap up and review before we move on to the next topic. We started off with the context of a crude oil refinery that had an interesting situation where the price of both its input and its output was set by supplier and the regulator, and it had no control on both processes. There was a manufacturing time lag that allowed and created potential exposure, which actually had P&L impact. We then went out and looked at three things. We looked at the gross refining margin. But to calculate the gross refining margin, we actually had to figure out what was the portfolio of products the refinery was producing as part of its output. Based on this portfolio of products, we actually looked at changes in crude oil prices, moved that to changes in output prices, and then finally connected that to changes in the gross refining margin of the refinery in question between the period of 2005 and 2010. We then translated this into two tables. The first table was an impact on margin. The second table was an impact on inventory. And we took both of these to sit down with the customer and try and build a plan for estimating what exactly was the risk preference and tolerance of the customer, what was the desired protection level, what was the pricing, and then based on their reaction to the pricing, what was the appropriate structure. I hope this gives you some sense of the amount of work and effort that's required in estimating the actual exposure that a client has to a given commodity, and then translating that exposure in a structure that makes sense. And then once that structure is presented to a customer and a client, depending on their reaction to the price of that structure, modifying and tweaking that structure so that it comes in within their price bracket. This is a process that goes on an iterative basis, and there's a fair amount of back and forth between the client, between the bank or the advisor, which is you in the specific question, and any execution agents that you have at the back that are actually physically deploying and implementing the structure that you'd use for the transaction in question. I hope you enjoyed the session so far, and I hope you now have a better sense of the task and the road in front of you with respect to estimating customer exposure. Thank you very much for your time. This is Jawad Ahmed Fareed signing off for financetrainingcourses.com.